Good morning, everyone. Welcome to North Orange. My name is Bryan. I'm one of the elders here, and welcome to our service today. If you've kind of noticed a little bit of difference, yes, our pastoral staff and our staff are basically away at a retreat this weekend. It's a perfect time for them to sort of get away. They're with their families. It's an opportunity for them to recharge, to get in unity with just God's direction, and to get on the same page, and to prepare and recharge themselves, and really get ready to serve us during this kind of new year as we kind of come into the fall season here. And so please be praying for them. They're on their way home today, and it just shows you just how much we really value them. But Sundays, every day, every week during the year, every Sunday, they're just here to kind of serve us, and so we're allowing them some time to do that. But in the meantime, you get me today to give you the sermon here, and I knew this day was probably coming for a long time, but for those of you that don't know, I have my master's in theology from Talbot Seminary. It took me 7 years to get my degree, and of those 7 years, I did not take a single preaching class. So we'll see how this goes. As they used to say when we were in youth group and the youth pastor was sick, they used to say, well, the inmates are running the asylum today. So let's get into it here. But happy to kind of go preach to you today and go through just the sermons, go through the parables here. Today's parable is the Good Samaritan, and it is something that all of us really know. It's pretty much in our vernacular. When you think about the Good Samaritan, right, we hear news stories, we know about that already. It already gives us kind of an image here. And so I'm going to just kind of, I just, Googled 3 kind of recent, in the last couple of months, some Good Samaritan stories in the news here. So let me share a few with you here. In April 2026, a small single-engine aircraft experienced sudden mechanical failure and crashed heavily into the parking lot of an auto parts store in Pacoima. The force of the impact left the plane completely crumpled and flipped upside down, pinning the pilot inside. Rather than waiting for heavy extraction machinery, a large group of local bystanders immediately banded together and used their collective bare hands to physically lift the plane's heavy fuselage. Their swift intervention relieved pressure on the cockpit and freed the trapped pilot before paramedics arrived. In August of 2026, BNSF railroad track supervisor Mike Anson was driving a high-rail truck through Devore when he noticed a heavily damaged, rolled vehicle hidden far down an embankment. The car was completely invisible to passing highway motorists, and so Anson climbed down the steep slope, found a badly injured woman pinned inside the wreckage. Knowing that a standard stretcher evacuation up the Looster would be delayed and dangerous, Anson kept the driver calm, loaded her onto the specialized rail-capable truck, and navigated the tracks to a flat railroad crossing where an ambulance was safely waiting to take over. In July of 2026, a massive house fire broke out in Hidden Meadow Way in Sacramento, entirely engulfing the roof while a teenager was trapped asleep inside. Cortland Johnson, the owner of a nearby tree solutions company, noticed the flames and rushed over. Using a rock from the front porch, Johnson smashed open a front window to create an entry point. Another bystander, Aiden Coons, climbed inside to help guide the trapped teen out. Thanks to their quick actions, the teenager escaped the rapidly moving fire with only minor scrapes and bruises. Don't we always kind of get these news stories? Every so often when we watch the news or we scroll through stuff, there's always that one that's like that feel-good story that's sort of like, wow, it kind of gives you some hope back into people, like, hey, there are good people out there willing to help strangers like that. Why do we not see it more often in that way? So let me kind of ask you this. Take for a moment, just a minute to think about, okay, when was the last time I actually stopped and helped a complete stranger? Like, I actually stopped and went out of my way to do something for someone that's not in my circle, not in my normal kind of everyday life, not part of my job. When did I actually take a moment to actually stop and do something for someone else? So just take a moment to kind of think about that, think through, So some people, some of you, it might have been like, oh my goodness, that's like just a couple hours ago, like on the way to church, I rescued pushed a baby out of a stroller in front of a moving bus, or I got a kitten out of out of a tree and stuff like that. Some of you, this is second nature, basically, that you're just able to just do things for other people, and that's your gift, right? You just notice that people are hurting, and you just go out of the way and help no matter who they are. For a lot of you, maybe it kind of took a minute for that. I am one of those people, right? I had to kind of think about this, and I was thinking, oh my goodness, when's the last time I actually did something nice for someone? And I was thinking back, okay, so a month ago, we were coming back from a trip at LAX, and as you kind of know that as you're leaving the plane and going to like the luggage area, everyone's sort of in a rush. Like, you're trying to get out of there, and especially it's LAX, so it's like a long way, it's like that. And so we're sort of walking out, trying to get to the luggage area, and we get to the escalators, and of course it's LA, so being nice, there was kind of a lady, we were heading toward the escalator at the same time, and a lady is sort of, walking her dog along, and it's LA, so it's one of those like foo-foo dog types of things, and so she's walking, and me trying to be nice, I just sort of like, oh, go ahead, right? I made the gesture like, go ahead, please, go first like that. And so the lady's, trying to go down the escalator. Well, she gets on the first step, but of course, you know what? That dog does not want to go on the escalator, right? It's a moving stairwell. Why would a dog ever want to do that? So she's like trying to drag this poor little dog basically down. The dog's not wanting to go down the escalator. It's just holding it up. We're all backed up in this way, just kind of waiting, like watching. It's like another good minute. And she's just dragging. Finally, she just picks up the dog and says, well, we're going to take the elevator there. And I'm like, well, see, that's why you don't do nice things for people, because it's just like ruins it all like that. But, that's kind of like, oh, that's like the best thing I can think of. So when I'm saying, and when we're talking about the sermon about, how you should do this, really, it's me as well. And some of us are guilty at the same time of just not going out of our way to do nice things for people. And I understand how hard that is. So let's kind of look into this and understand, maybe why don't we see this more often? Why is it always like 9 bad stories in the news and then 1 kind of good, uplifting story in that? If we are truly people of God, why aren't these things happening more often? So let's dive into the parables here. If you have your Bible or some app, turn to me with Luke 10, 25 to 37. This is the parable of the Good Samaritan here. And we'll unpack it a little bit here. Just to give you some background here, so parables are really quick, easy, allegorical, like analogy type of stories. It's meant to be very simple. It usually conveys 1 or 2 very simple points. The thing about parables is that if you kind of go too deep into it or get too detailed or try to really overanalyze it, it's not going to work. Like, it's going to break down. Like, you can't do too much theology from it. You can't go really deep into it because it's just not going to carry out. It's meant for a very specific teaching, and it's supposed to be understood very easily by the specific audience that it was intended to be conveyed to. So some of the background, and when I look at parables, I really like to understand, okay, what's the context, what's the surrounding circumstances as to why this parable is being taught. And so in Luke 10, basically at the beginning of the chapter, Jesus has sent out 72 of his disciples to go in advance to all the towns that he's planning to visit and to basically be his ambassadors, to kind of announce to the town that Jesus is coming, maybe be a bit of a witness. And you sort of get like this modern day sort of like, it's basically the ancient times like social media for Jesus, right? He actually has people to go out there and announce for him that he's coming. And that's how sort of Jesus got these crowds following him. You wonder, like, did Jesus just show up and everyone followed him? And no, there was actually people, there was ambassadors, there were people that were going out and kind of spreading his news. And then that's why people would sort of follow him when he got into a town. And so as they were sort of reporting back, and so this is the time when all the 72 sort of came back and was reporting, and Jesus was instructing his disciples on basically what was expected of his ambassadors. How should they be conducting themselves? How should they be living as people who are going out to, communicate to others about him? And we pick up the story in verse 25 here, where we find out, and it says here, "Behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, 'Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?'" And we'll stop here at 25 just to say, all right, already Luke gives us an idea that here's a lawyer coming down. And whether, you're a lawyer, you think about, what you think about lawyers, there's someone who's coming to kind of understand sort of the black and white, like, how do I kind of navigate this? The right and wrong, what side of the law am I following the law on this end here? And in verse 26, he said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" This is Jesus' response to him. And in verse 27, the lawyer says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus replied and said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." So we get the lawyer who knows the law, he knows the commandments, he knows that from Deuteronomy 6:5, that is our charge as people of God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, right? And then love your neighbors as yourself. That is kind of what the charge was. That's what the lawyers sort of wanted to follow and kind of find out from Jesus. And so Jesus answers correctly and says, hey, yeah, you get it. You know the law. Do this and you will live. Verse 29, there's an interesting kind of, then it continues, right? Okay, it's like, that was a simple question. How come the lawyer didn't want to kind of give it up? But then we find out, and then the lawyer says to him, but he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? So he kind of goes a little further, and he wants to know a little more about, oh, wait, okay, so if the second part is love your neighbor, who is my neighbor? And so that's where Jesus kind of introduces this parable. He uses the parable then to answer this question. And so as we go through the parable here, think of, there's going to be two questions that are kind of persisting in the context of why this parable was asked, right? Number one is, how do I get into heaven? So, very simple, right? What must I do to inherit eternal life? Follow the commandments. And number two is, who do I need to show love to, right? So underlying the question is, who is my neighbor? That's essentially what the lawyer is asking, is that who is the person that I'm actually supposed to show my love to? And so let's kind of dive into the parable and kind of unpack, but remember those two questions here. So the parable starts in verse 30 right here. Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. So right away, we sort of get this picture of this. And remember with parables, these are things that people would have known. These are kind of understanding context. And so in the context of sort of geography and the area of like the way things were at the time, Jerusalem and Jericho is about 18 miles apart. And from Jericho, Jerusalem is sort of like high up in elevation. It's about like 3,500 feet. And when they always talk about in the Bible, like going down from Jerusalem, that's why they meant that. And when you go up to Jerusalem, it's literally like hiking, like a 3,000-foot mountain, essentially coming up and down, up and down. Remember, there's no modern roadways, there's no streets or anything like that. So this is essentially like a hiking path. And so 18 miles on a journey, if you wanted to commute from a city to a city, that's going to be all day. If you were maybe a cross-country runner, maybe good 10 hours, 12 hours to do that. In our time, like my body, it's going to take all day basically to get there, if I even get there at that point. So people knew about that. At the same time, the terrain, it wasn't like there's city all the way. So there's going to be terrain that's going to be rocky. It's going to be very easy. If you were traveling alone, it's very easy to basically get mugged, get jumped basically on this. And this is what happened to this man. You get this picture of an ordinary man, probably we're supposed to envision ourselves, just ordinary person doing a commute and then getting jumped along the road along that way, right? I was thinking about a couple years ago, I was in Chicago for a work conference, and so my coworkers and I wanted to go see a White Sox game. So we got tickets, took an Uber down to the White Sox game. Game was great, beautiful stadium, all that stuff. We knew it was going to be kind of crowded afterwards, and we didn't want to get caught up in the traffic, and so we decided to leave a little early because we had to call an Uber to come pick us up, and we didn't want to be waiting around too long because we were kind of in the south side of Chicago. And so if anyone sort of knows about the south side of Chicago, it's probably not the best neighborhood. Chicago at one point, had the highest murder count, per person rate in the U.S. And so we were like, yeah, let's kind of get out of here when there's a lot of people around. So we left at the 8th inning, and we called our Uber right outside the stadium, and we kept watching the tracker, and all of a sudden the Uber started it's coming down the street, and then it would sort of veer to the right. And then it would kind of make a U-turn and kind of veer the other way and kind of come down the round. And then finally, why can't this guy just come down the street? We're right here. So we called him, and he says, yeah, the police have basically blocked off all the roads into the stadium. And it turns to find out that because a lot of these old stadiums are right in the middle of a city, right, residential, to ease traffic, they didn't want all these Ubers driving through these neighborhoods. So the police had actually blocked off Ubers from getting into the stadium for like 10 blocks. There was a 10-block radius where you couldn't even get to. So we're like, oh man, we gotta hike it out. So basically, me and my buddies from work, we start walking, just pick a direction, and we're walking. And a couple blocks, there's a lot of people. As you start slowly getting each block, we're noticing, oh, there's less and less people here. And then as we're walking even more, we're like, uh-oh, there's no one here. I'm starting to okay, another 2 blocks or so, and I'm looking behind me, who's around here? It's dark, the sun's gone down, and just like out of the movies, we end up on this corner where it's like a commercial district. There's one street light above us. There's literally no one around, and we're like, oh, great. We're in the south side of Chicago. we're three guys, and this is it. This is gonna be bad. We start praying like crazy. Luckily, at the end, our Uber comes, and we're fine and like that way. But it was known to people at that time that it might be a regular occurrence. If you're traveling alone, you might sort of get jumped on that end. And that's why you hear in the Bible people always traveling in groups, and when people were commuting back and forth to towns, they were usually in big groups for that safety. So as we continue on in the verse here, verse 31 to 32, now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Let's pause for a moment and say, okay, now we get a part of the story where he says, now by chance, as if there's some hope, right? There's an idea that basically a priest, someone who's an ambassador for, who serves the church, who serves God, this is the best person that would basically be passing by this poor guy who's just been jumped and is left for half dead. He comes by. The problem is now the priest, seeing the person half dead on the ground, purposely goes on the other side of the street, essentially, to avoid him and walk around him. You see him. He says when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. He literally sort of walks across, intentionally out of his way to not help this poor individual. Verse 32 here. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. And so Levites, if you sort of understand the tribes of Israel, the tribe of Levite, if you were sort of that tribe, of that background, you were basically charged with sort of serving the temple or serving sort of the religious part. You were supposed to be sort of the priest amongst the 12 tribes of Israel. And so your lineage meant that every so often you would probably have to serve in the church or do something. So someone who's sort of the religious elect of a Levite, if you were known as that, you were, again, someone associated with the church, someone associated with God as someone who would help, right? Someone else who was expected to do that. And what does he do? He does the same thing. He sees the individual half dead, and he purposely walks on the other side to essentially avoid him, right? It's like that whole, I don't see you, I don't want to help you, I'm gonna avoid you in that way. So you get that picture, like the people who were expected to help this person, who were ambassadors of God, just avoided them altogether. And then we get into verses 33 to 35. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. He set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn, took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." What a beautiful picture, right? Of someone, like, essentially you get that idea of someone who's supposed to do what you're supposed to, just being a decent human being, helping someone who is injured or in trouble, and doing what he can to do that. So let's kind of take a step back and understand, why is this Samaritan kind of standing out in that way? And culturally, if you're not familiar with the idea of Samaritans and Jews, they essentially didn't like each other. There's a lot of history, there's a lot of issues behind it. It's very layered in that way, like it always is. Back in the times when it was the Assyrians sort of taking over the empire, Samaria and Israel, they were kind of in the same area, right? So there was essentially the same type of people. A lot of them are ethnically, Jewish in that nature, but the people of Samaria basically allowed, when the Assyrians and other empires came in, they were pretty much open to being kind of taken over by another empire. They were okay intermingling, like intermarrying essentially, and so they were okay letting sort of like them to abandon their culture and absorb more of whatever the controlling empire's culture was. And so because of that, Jews sort of looked down on them. They kind of looked at them as like, oh, those are people who basically abandoned their culture and were okay, like intermingling, intermarrying, sort of like the Harry Potter, pure blood versus half blood. They kind of looked at them in that way. The form of religion they still practice a little bit of Judaism, but it wasn't kind of the same spots. Like, Jewish people kind of saw Israel, the Jerusalem area, as sort of like the temple area, and that's where God is. The Samaritans saw Mount Gerizim as sort of like their holy site. That was like sort of where their temple was in that way. Samaritans also followed basically only the Torah, which was the first 5 books of the Bible, but nothing else. Versus the Jewish people would sort of like acknowledge all the other books and stuff like that. So there was already a lot of just kind of differences sort of built in, almost to that animosity, hatred level in that way. Obviously, there's a bit of racism there, religious intolerance, cultural intolerance like that. So essentially, it got to that point in Jesus' times where they just didn't like each other. They were just a people group. If you were a Samaritan, you were basically sort of talked down upon. Same thing if you were a Samaritan toward a Jew, you just didn't like each other in that way, right? Sharks and jets or whatever you want to call it in that way. So the thing about the Samaritan then is that when we sort of look at that, there's some interesting things that's actually in the Bible that you sort of can't see in the translation, but in the Greek, Samaritan is very highlighted as if it's emphasized. It's the first word of that verse. So Samaritan is almost capitalized as a Samaritan came upon him. And it's basically to draw us to that detail of specifically a Samaritan person, a person who wasn't the most likely person to come help this person, jumps into action, right? The other ones, it's a very brief description of a priest and a Levite or whatever, but you have a very specific type of person coming to see and help this man. And you see the motivation as well. When he saw him, he had compassion. That is sort of the key word for this part of the verse, is to say he had compassion. And based on the compassion, he jumped into action, right? He basically essentially helped bandage this injured person. He put him in his animal, which is essentially his car, drove him to the nearest hospital, essentially. Not only at the hospital, he asked them to take care of him, but he basically left his credit card and said, put it on me. Everything that's you're gonna do, put it on me. Hey, if my credit card bounces, just keep the tab open. I'll come back and pay off the balance when I come back. Going out of his way, going apart from his schedule. He probably had things to do. He was on his way to somewhere. He went out of his way to do this kindness for someone that culturally he probably didn't really care for, and yet he went out of his way to do that. So like any good sermon, I've got 3 important points to kind of digest and kind of analyze from the story here. Point number 1, and we'll just kind of jump into it, is compassion should motivate action. When you kind of see the idea of those supposed religious leaders, supposedly the people who were ambassadors for God, and their actions show a lot about what's happening on the inside. Did they really care about following God's commandments of loving God and loving other people when they purposely went out of the way to not help this person, right? That was the commandment, right? Love your neighbor. And Jesus is telling his followers that those actions should be motivated by love. And you see the people who were expected to do that didn't do that. Versus the Samaritan, right? The motivation is the compassion for the person. He loved that person just as a decent human being. Didn't matter what what his political ways, culturally, what he looked like, what happened. He just did what we were created to do, was to help one another in that way. And you get that very easy picture of that. If you got that, and everyone sort of gets that, our world gets that. That's why we have so many stories of Good Samaritans in the news that pops up. We essentially call it Good Samaritan stories because that's what it's meant to do, right? The parable sort of does what it needs to do. It gives us that image. And so if we got that, great. That's the main idea of the parable. We should just be decent people, help each other out when we can. Doesn't matter the differences. Like that. I didn't want to do the cliche of actions speak louder than words, but essentially that's what it is, right? The actions that we do sort of is the outward showing of what's kind of going on inside of our heart, and it's that reflection of who we are. So very easy to understand. Very good. But let's remember the second question, right? The second question of the whole context of why this parable was taught or given was that the lawyer asked, well, who is my neighbor? And so point number 2 here is, our neighbors are whoever is in front of us. And to give you a little bit of background of just kind of the idea about why this lawyer might have been asking, well, who should my neighbor be? Here's the thing about sort of the people at the time for how they sort of interpret this. If you're following the commandments, doing everything God tells you to do, right, love my neighbor, if I interpret my neighbor as just the people close to me, my family, maybe it's the community that I'm only hangs out in. Maybe it's the people only literally next door that I like. It's my friends. It's the people that I'm used to. Maybe they look like me. They believe in the same things as me. If I believe that, then yeah, it's super easy to love these people, right? If it's all the same, it's very easy to do that. But that's where Jesus sort of then kind of rearranges and responds and basically says and answers the question of who is my neighbor. When you go to verse 36, he says, which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And Jesus, again, he questions the person and says, okay, he's throwing it back at him. Who really is defined as neighbor? And so that's what Jesus was challenging that lawyer to say, okay, here's who you need to understand. what neighbor really is. It's someone who might be culturally different, everything about you is opposite, and yet you're still going to sort of help them in that way. We see that picture of that Samaritan helping that person. When I was thinking about neighbors, I immediately went to the one thing and the one person who loved to call everyone his neighbors. Does anyone kind of know who that is? It's probably from my childhood. It is Mr. Rogers, right? The great late Mr. Rogers, right here. And so there's a quick picture of, so the trip that we were talking about. And if anyone knows this song and just growing up hearing this music, right, you know what the title of the song is and kind of hum along with it here. That's a picture of us in Pittsburgh. So a month ago when we were on that trip, we went to Pittsburgh, and one of the things we were able to do was actually go to the Heinz Museum. And if you don't know, Mr. Rogers filmed a show. He's actually from Pittsburgh. He was actually an ordained Presbyterian minister as well. He went to seminary. He actually regularly preached on Sundays at his church in Pittsburgh, which would have been awesome to see. But we got to actually see like my childhood like stuff come alive. Like they had the whole set right there. They had the set of the his house, the closet. They had the land of make-believe, like the castle there, the Daniel Tiger puppets and stuff. And then they had a whole area of just his wardrobe, right? And obviously Mr. Rogers is known for that, right? He had his suit that he'd come in as, and then he'd open the closet and pull out a little red or green vest, and he'd put that on, change his shoes. They had all of that stuff there. It was super amazing. They had all these other sort of wardrobes of people. And one of the things that was interesting, right? Mr. Rogers really believed in calling everyone his neighbors. And why did he kind of do that? And so one of the wardrobes that was kind of on display was Officer Clemens. And so Officer Clemens was the police officer on the show. He was a black man on the show. And it turns out that Francois Clemens, who is his real name, was a graduate student at the University of Pittsburgh as a music major. And so Francois Clemens attended Mr. Rogers' church, and they had come and talked because Mr. Rogers actually has a degree in music as well. So they were talking, and Mr. Rogers asked him if he would come onto his show. And they talked and said, yeah, I would love to. And Mr. Rogers said, I would love for you to be like the police officer, be Officer Clemens. And this is at the time of the 60s. And Francois Clemens kind of grew up in a neighborhood that was sort of racially segregated. He admitted to Mr. Rogers he didn't have a very fond view of police officers at the time. He was unsure if he wanted to play a police officer. And through many conversations, Mr. Rogers basically convinced him to say, hey, maybe if you come on as a police officer, people who are young people like you might feel a better understanding of what police officers do and actually aspire to actually help people and kind of bridge some of that separation in that way. And so Francois Clemens sort of agreed. And in this very landmark episode in 1969, and sort of the height of sort of the racial segregation debates in Pittsburgh, there was this debate about open pools, basically, segregated pools. And so Mr. Rogers actually invited in an episode to have Officer Clemens come in, and it would be a hot day, and Mr. Rogers invited Officer Clemens to say, hey, would you want to soak your feet in a pool together to kind of cool them off? And on that episode in 1969, Mr. Rogers and Officer Clemens sat bare feet in a pool together. And that was basically showing, kids and other people how amazing that would be. And that's okay to have differences and yet be in that same pool and treat each other with kindness and respect. Years later, here's a quote from Mr. Rogers on one of the episodes about love. And in the typical Mr. Rogers fashion, he would sit on the porch and kind of give that thought of the day. And here's this quote from that episode here. Well, it's very important to look inside yourself and find that loving part of you. That's the part that you must take good care of and never be mean to, because that's the part of you that allows you to love your neighbor. And your neighbor is anyone you happen to be with at any time in your life. Respecting and loving your neighbor can give everybody a good feeling. Isn't that an amazing quote there by Mr. Rogers? Like he leaves kids with that kind of idea. To kind of just end the story here, years later, Officer Clemens or Francois Clemens and Mr. Rogers, Francois kind of takes a different path in life. He ends up divorcing his wife, unfortunately. He comes out as sort of a closeted gay black man. And yet, in that whole time, Mr. Rogers still invited him to come on to the show and be Officer Clemens. Even though maybe they were kind of drifting in ideology, he still sort of kept Officer Clemens on the show and called him his neighbor and still had him appear. Later on in the 90s, the last episode, and this is written at the Heinz Museum. This was the story I was sort of reading about Officer Clemens' wardrobe here, is that Officer Clemens, they were kind of recognizing there was still some racial stuff happening in the U.S. in the early 90s, and so he wanted to reenact that scene. So they reenacted that scene of Officer Clemens and him coming out and Mr. Rogers inviting Officer Clemens to sit and soak his feet in the pool together. So they did that whole scene together. But at the end of the scene, Mr. Rogers actually takes a towel and dries off Officer Clemens' feet for him. And Officer Clemens, or Francois Clemens, actually says he was always struck by that because growing up in the church, he remembered that story of Jesus washing his disciples' feet and immediately had that image and embodied how Mr. Rogers was there to serve him in that way. And that really stuck with him. And so I thought that was a beautiful story, just amazing of just the guy Mr. Rogers was, of calling everyone a neighbor and living that out in that way. All right, so the final point here. Point number 3, and this is a little bit embedded, but and like I said, you shouldn't go too deep into it, but I think it's a great visual of just something bigger, is that Jesus pays in advance. This is the last point here, is that Jesus essentially pays in advance for us. And when you kind of think back at the first question that I said, right, what was that first question? How do I get into heaven? It's got to be through Jesus. When we sort of look at the analogy in that story, we should see ourselves as that sort of, as we kind of go through life and traveling, there's going to be things that are going to beat us down. We're injured, we're hurt. Sin is sort of that thing that wounds us in that way. And Jesus is on his way to sort of pick us up and to deliver us in that way. And it's sort of how life is, right? Jesus at the time, that was his mission. He was already telling his disciples, yeah, I'm doing these temporary things, but I'm gonna come back, and I'm gonna come back for you. He was on a mission. So in the moment, he was healing people, he was serving people and loving other people, but yet he had an ultimate mission, which was go to the cross and pay in advance for our sins and everything like that. And so just a beautiful picture of Jesus promising that, yeah, no matter as we go forward in life, as we're still healing, we're still recovering from things that are going on, Jesus pays in advance for us. So to conclude kind of the sermon or the parable here and to kind of close off, we get to verse 37, and Jesus says, the answer to what the lawyer says, right? Jesus says, the one who showed him mercy, Jesus said to him, you go and do likewise. So he answers the lawyer's question and says, who's my neighbor? Who is the person who did right? It was the person who showed him mercy. Mercy is kind of an interesting word because the lawyer didn't really want to say compassion. He said, the one who showed him mercy. So you can kind of say maybe he was struggling a little bit. But Jesus sort of gives us the clear answer right here and says, it's the person who basically shows compassion. You need to go and do likewise in that way. As I kind of conclude here, growing up in the 90s, one of my favorite TV shows was Seinfeld. And if everyone ever watched Seinfeld, I'm probably dating myself in a little bit like that. I thought it was the funniest show. It probably shows you a little bit about the humor that I have. It's a show about nothing, but it basically, these 4 characters here, Kramer, George, Elaine, Jerry, essentially throughout the show, they were not nice people. They were very selfish. They basically did things for themselves. And so the series finale after 9 seasons was very controversial. It was one of those things where, maybe it didn't land right, but at the time, this is what the series finale was about. It was about the 4 characters basically getting stuck into a city in Massachusetts. And what happens is they're walking on the street and there is an obese man driving a car and he's getting carjacked. And so there's a person at gunpoint basically sort of carjacking this man. And rather than the 4 sort of helping the person or doing anything, the 4 actually just start making jokes about it. They start audibly making fat jokes. They're talking about the government. They don't spring into any action. And so when the police arrive, they actually arrest the 4 characters because the city had just enacted a Good Samaritan law, meaning that if you didn't go and help people, you would be arrested. Now, don't worry, in California, our Good Samaritan law is a little different. It's basically to protect you. So if you do spring into action to someone, it's going to protect you in case stuff doesn't go wrong. But it was opposite for the series, right? They basically used that as a premise. And so the second half of the whole finale is them basically being in a courtroom, being put on trial, and the prosecution was bringing in character witnesses to show how bad of these people are, how bad of just, bad people they are. They should be convicted because they were not good Samaritans. And so the whole second half of the show is basically all the characters that the series ever had coming to testify and replaying everything that happened, right? There's the story of the old grandma who basically, she had a little piece of marble rye bread and Jerry comes up and basically robs her and steals her poor marble rye bread. there's this episode, they brought in this guy called the Soup Nazi who was very like a restaurant guy, and he, the whole no soup for you, and Elaine sort of ruins his business because she exposes him because he was mean to her, and so she basically ruins his business. George worked for the Yankees, and he basically slept under his desk all the time. So again, these were just not nice people. And it was kind of interesting to watch it. It was obviously funny to kind of reminisce about people like that, but it got me to thinking, okay, if we were to ever be put on trial, let's say at the end of our lives, we were put on trial, and all the people in our life that ever encountered us, they were to be on this witness stand and talk and testify about how we acted toward them. What would they say? Would there be enough to basically convict us or prove to us about the type of person that we are? Were we good Samaritans to people in life, or were we just completely mean and not like that? Let's be reminded of Jesus' sort of final words to us, and the idea is that it's a command, right? It's you go and do likewise, like the Samaritan in that way. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father God, we thank you so much for just this parable and this great visual reminder. It's a very easy story to understand, but it's a hard thing to live it out. And so I just ask that you would just give us that conviction, that motivation, especially in our hearts, that when we truly love one another, that we would be able to show it, that it would be toward people who maybe are not like us, who maybe aren't in our circles, maybe they don't look like us, maybe they have ideological differences, political differences, differences in sports and stuff like that. Whatever it may be, that we would be a reflection of just our love for you by showing them compassion, by showing love to our neighbors in that way. And so help us to live that and be a reflection of who you are and what you command us to be. In your name I pray, amen.